All right. Hello again, Avengers, and welcome to another exciting daily December video. And I have something in my eye. Wow, that was unpleasant. All right, let's try it again. Another exciting daily December video. It's day December day 4, and today we are going to be continuing our look at the history of role-playing games by going into the 2000's. Quick reminder, the whole kind of purpose of... sorry, I'm scrolling through a very long list of things so I can get to the right spot. All right. Quick reminder, the entire reason that I'm doing this was based on an interview that I'm not going to rehash the entire thing this time. But it gave me the idea that there are a lot of people that are playing tabletop RPGs today that really don't understand the history and where a lot of the stuff that we just kind of take for granted now came from. And so I thought it'd be fun to kind of look at some of the bigger titles as they were released throughout the years and talk about kind of the impact that they had on the community as a whole, on the economics of the system, on the marketing, everything like that. So, yeah. So, without any further ado, let's start the beginning of the year 2000. The year 2000 really is a turning point for tabletop RPGs in general. Because everything that happened before the year 2000 was kind of predicated on the idea that you basically had to create your own system every time you wanted to enter the market. And there were a few companies that were able to create a system that was malleable enough that they could create multiple products with it. But a lot of times people were just going, well, how closely can I mimic this system without having to worry about getting sued? And so because of that, unless you were someone like White Wolf or obviously TSR or a few of the other big gaming companies in the 80s and 90s, a lot of times your RPG was not really going to get a ton of notoriety because you simply didn't have the ability to compete with these big companies. Which isn't 100% different from today, but starting in the year 2000, something did change that vastly changed the market, and that was the release of the D20 system. I'm going to look here because I actually don't remember specifically when it was released. It just says 2000. So in the year 2000 sometime, D&D was updated to the 3rd edition. D&D had been purchased from TSR in the late 90s. Hasbro had purchased Wizards of the Coast in the late 90s as well. And so they'd been working on this 3rd edition of D&D for a pretty decent amount of time. They released it in the year 2000. And the 3rd edition of D&D was ground-breaking for a number of different reasons. Just for the idea of D&D in and of itself, 3rd edition was the largest departure from the previous edition that had happened thus far. Like going from basic D&D to advanced D&D, they were still technically compatible. D&D 2nd edition was not compatible with D&D 1st edition, but there was a lot of stuff that was very, very similar. The big change between 1st edition and 2nd edition of D&D was a significantly lower reliance on tables. In basic D&D and 1st edition D&D, there were tables for everything. And so instead of just rolling a d20 and then adding a number to it and then comparing it to some sort of difficulty class, you would roll a d20 and then you would look you would have to find the table for that particular character or that particular thing, and you would match up different rows and columns to figure out what the number you were supposed to roll was. It was very time consuming. It was not fun. Second edition streamlined D&D to the point where most of your rolls were a D20, and then you would just add a number to it in some way, shape, or form, with a few stuff held over from for first edition, like percentile rolls for like disarming traps and things like that. When you get to third edition, everything changed. Third edition kept the D20 plus number, but they added a skill system, a significantly more robust skill system, because technically there were skills in second edition, but they were kind of scant, to say the least. Third edition had this massive skill system. Third edition, as opposed to earlier edition where multi-classing was either something that only non-human races could do, or it was something that you basically had to plan right from character creation, and the idea of like dual classing, which was introduced in second edition. It was very, very rare to multiclass, and multiclassing in and of itself was generally something that happened right at the beginning of character creation. Like you might be a fighter thief or something like that. You couldn't take a bunch of classes levels in fighter and then decide to become a thief later on, unless you were dual classing, and that was its own nightmare of a thing. Third edition, multiclassing was the norm. To the point that they had specific multiclassing rules where if you did multiclass, the lower level class actually had a crap ton of penalties added to it until it got to the right level. And all the races had their own preferred class that wouldn't cause those penalties. They introduced prestige classes, which is another thing that required multi-classing and planning and things like that. They introduced the feat system. So it was this massive change, significantly more different than the jump from first edition to second edition. And it was one of the first times where people were not particularly keen to jump over to the new edition. I'm not saying that nobody was playing basic D&D when second edition came out or anything like that, but it started to become a real kind of friction point there because of just how massively different it was. And it would fuel the edition wars going later on. At the exact same time that they released D&D 3rd edition, they also released what was called the D20 system, using a document called the System Reference Document, the SRD, and it was licensed under this thing as called the Open Game License. If you were around here last year, around January of last year, there was that whole big debacle with the OGL that was mostly based on lies and misinformation by a really dishonest journalist that's no longer a journalist. So anyway, the Open Games License changed the face of tabletop gaming, because basically what it was, and the kind of genesis of the Open Game License was, in order for anyone to be able to make content, to make a tabletop RPG, you had to create your own tabletop RPG, which took a lot of resources. And then, in order to keep making money, you had to release supplements. Well, there are significantly diminishing returns on the sales of supplement books. Basically, your core book would sell really well, and then your first supplement would sell okay, but not quite as well. Next one, okay, but still not quite, and it would go worse and worse until eventually you couldn't afford to release another supplement, and that's when you would create a new quote-unquote edition. And that's how tabletop gaming had been working for a little while. With the Open Game License, it completely took away the need to create your own brand new tabletop system. You could simply take 3rd edition D&D, modify it a little bit, and now you had your own system. And games started to blow up. There are D20 games based on just about anything you could possibly think of. A lot of them published by Wizards of the Coast, but even more of them published by every other company. There were also, this is also one of the first times where you could legally create and sell supplements to D&D without having to either get it approved or actually have to work for, it used to be TSR and now it's Wizards of the Coast. So third-party content became a really, really big deal. I cannot overstate what a massive, massive deal the D20 system was and the open game license was, because after that, we started seeing a lot, especially more recently, we started seeing a lot more companies creating system reference documents and OGLs, their own kind of open game license for their games. And it massively changed how people consume tabletop RPGs. It changed how companies were able to support not only their own games, but other games and stuff like that. Like, it really was a turning point for tabletop RPGs. Whether you like it or not, third edition D&D is probably the most influential tabletop RPG that has ever been created, aside from the original Dungeons and Dragons, and that's specifically because of the open game license. And the interesting thing about the open game license, again, it was created for D&D. And so at first, a lot of the games created with the OGL were basically D&D clones. They were all kind of high fantasy, magic-based stuff. But you go 2 years later, and Wizards of the Coast releases a new version of the D20 system called D20 Modern. Now, I'm not 100% certain. I don't think anything from D20 Modern was included in the open game license or the SRD. But I'm not 100% on that. So if anyone, again, was playing during this time, I didn't get into the hobby until the 2010s is when I started actively playing. So if anyone could tell me if D20 Modern actually had its own OGL or its own SRD, I'd be really interested in knowing that. But even if it didn't, anyone, I talk about this all the time in my in-depth reviews. If you understand how to look at something, and I call it templating it, which is basically looking at examples of something and then kind of reverse engineering the template that was used to create them. You very easily could use D20 Modern to create a bunch of different things, still just using the OGL, just taking inspiration from D20 Modern. So D20 Modern was exactly that. Instead of it being a high fantasy setting, this was a modern setting. It was meant to not only, if you wanted to play a more modern game like, Vampire the Masquerade, set in modern times, you could. They also could do cyberpunk stuff, science fiction, though we'll talk about later, they actually put out specific supplements to kind of help with that. The other thing that was interesting about the D20 Modern system was the basic D20 system, you just had your standard kind of character classes, your fighter, rogue, stuff like that, wizard. The basic classes in the D20 Modern series were strong hero, fast hero, tough hero, smart hero, dedicated hero, charismatic hero. And each one had a specific ability score that they tended to use the most. The strong hero, obviously strength, fast hero, dexterity, tough hero, constitution, smart, intelligence, dedicated, wisdom, charismatic, charisma. And then there was a bunch of advanced classes, which were the prestige classes, which again was a core part of D&D, the third edition. You could not get to high levels without either having a really weird mismatch of basic classes or using at least one prestige class. So yeah, like I said, D20 Modern was not just, oh, here's Dungeons and Dragons, but in modern times. They did actually make they did actually make some changes to it to make it a kind of unique system. So, yeah, so that was 2002. Moving on. Needed a drink. My water's gone. Oh no, what am I going to do? Maybe open another one. Should also mention in the year 2000, Orc, the role-playing game, came out. The game itself is not really that groundbreaking, but it was one of the first games that Green Ronin Publishing put out. Green Ronin Publishing is one of the larger tabletop RPG publishers nowadays. They created the Age system, which was first created for the Dragon Age RPG. We'll talk all about that stuff in the 2010s version of this. But I like to make mention they now exist. But we'll talk about something they make a little bit later. I just wanted to mention Orc was technically their first game. So, moving forward. And there were a ton of D20, like just skimming through this as we go to the next big game I'm talking about. Dinosaur Planet Bronchosaurus Rex by Goodman Games. It's a D20 system game in 2001. Dragon Lords of Melnibone by Chaosium. Dragon Star by Fantasy Flight. What other ones did we have? Weird Wars by Pinnacle was a D20 system that eventually changed into Savage Worlds. We'll talk about them in a little bit here. Forbidden Kingdoms by Otherworld Creations, another D20 system. It just goes on and on and on. And then finally, in 2002, shortly after the D20 Modern came out, White Wolf Publishing, the people that make the Vampire the Masquerade games and the World of Darkness games, again, in the 90s, they were poised to beat TSR and Dungeons & Dragons as the most popular tabletop RPG. What did they do in 2002? They released the EverQuest role-playing game. Now, if anyone is unaware of what EverQuest is, EverQuest was not the first MMO. Different people will claim different things were the first quote-unquote MMORPG. Ultima Online was probably the first like really big, popular MMO, and then there was a game called, I think it was called Neverwinter Nights, but it wasn't the Neverwinter Nights that we know on PC. It was actually an MMO version. Those are two of the first two that were kind of really big. EverQuest was bigger than anything that had ever been. It became something like it was something that the news would talk about because there would be stories of people playing EverQuest so long that they would become dehydrated and have to be hospitalized over it. It was colloquially referred to as Evercrack because it was so addictive. They had created this incredible system that just rewarded you for playing for forever and ever. And EverQuest in and of itself changed MMOs for the rest of history. Well, EverQuest came out, I want to say it was in either 99 or 97. I want to say it was 99. I can look here because I have it right in front of me. EverQuest came out, 1999. So 3 years after EverQuest came out, White Wolf Publishing, under its Sword and Sorcery Studios imprint, which is basically all of their non-World of Darkness stuff, released EverQuest, the role-playing game, and it was a D20 system-based Now, it wasn't just D&D, but EverQuest. They did add enough changes to it that there were technically two different flavors of D20 based Giga games. There were games that actually had on them D20 system brand, which meant that they were basically just D&D or some version of the D20 system, but with different flavor added. And then there were games like EverQuest where it used the open game license and the system reference document to create most of the rules, but they would add enough to it that the game was no longer compatible with every other D20 based system. And so that's what EverQuest was. It wasn't technically a D20 system license or a branded Giga game, but it did use a version of the D20 system, a heavily modified version of the D20 system, and it did use the open game license to be able to publish itself. Again, the RPG in and of itself was not that groundbreaking. I know very few people that were even aware that there was a tabletop RPG version of EverQuest, and I know even less people that actually played it. In fact, I don't think I know a single person that ever played the EverQuest RPG. However, the thing that makes it notable is it is the idea of video games starting to influence tabletop RPGs as opposed to the other way around. The first RPGs that were ever created were inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. Any game that uses like a class system or you gain experience points in, all that stuff can kind of eventually trace its roots back to some version of Dungeons and Dragons. And so it was very, very common for tabletop RPGs to influence the video game market, especially Dungeons and Dragons. But as I said before, the Buck Rogers game, Buck Rogers in the 25th century, that was the video games. There are tons of D&D based video games, including one of my personal favorites, Dark Sun Shattered Lands. So it was not uncommon for tabletop RPGs to influence the video game market, and they did over and over and over again, and a lot of them were very, very well received. The Baldur's Gate series, the Neverwinter Nights was hailed as a phenomenally exceptional game. But now we're seeing video games start to influence the tabletop market. And the EverQuest role-playing game is a really good example of that. The interesting thing about it was by 2005, they had already released basically the second edition of the EverQuest role-playing game, which they called EverQuest 2, which I don't think it was related to the actual EverQuest 2. I need history of EverQuest 2. Though it might have been, because EverQuest 2 came out in 2004. And EverQuest 2 was not a massive change to the world. EverQuest 2 was basically meant to compete with World of Warcraft, despite the fact that they both came out right around the same time. EverQuest 2 came out November 8th of 2004. World of Warcraft came out November 23rd. But it had been making waves and stuff like that, so EverQuest is going, well, we need a new system. And EverQuest 2, people generally didn't like it. You can still play it today. But people generally didn't like it. It didn't change the market anywhere near like what EverQuest, the original EverQuest, did. And again, because it came out so close to World of Warcraft, and World of Warcraft changed MMOs permanently. So anyway, the EverQuest tabletop RPG. I don't know if you can get it anymore. Maybe I'm gonna see if you can actually get it anymore. Wow, you can get it on Amazon. You can actually get the book. Uh, that's hilarious. Wow. But as far as like, I'm gonna check to see if maybe they have it on like Drive-Thru RPG. It doesn't look like it. I think it might just not exist anymore. Yeah. So that's a dead system and everything. But anyway, EverQuest role playing game. Moving on. The next tabletop game, also in 2002, is Mutants and Masterminds. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is not so much that, again, Mutants and Masterminds was not, again, this groundbreaking thing that changed the world or anything. It's a cool system, don't get me wrong. And it was a superhero based variant of the D20 system. However, it was Green Ronin publishing, and it was significantly more successful than Orc ever was. And again, Green Ronin at this point was not the, I guess, juggernaut that it is now, where it had all these different games under its belt. It was really, really it was really, really kind of niche, and it was just starting to get its feet. And Mutants and Masterminds was a really successful title for it, which again still exists today. I can't remember because I believe they no longer. I don't believe they still use the D20 system for Mutants and Mastermind, but I might be wrong about that. But you can still buy it today. There was a Humble Bundle where you could get the third edition that I can't remember if I picked up or not. But anyway, so I wanted to talk specifically about Mutants and Masterminds, and I'll probably do this a few more times to just talk about game publishers that maybe this particular game wasn't massive, but it was one of their early ones. And we eventually will talk about their massive games that actually kind of cemented them as part of the market. So, yeah, moving on. The next game that I will talk about is Savage Worlds. Savage Worlds came out in 2003. This is another generic system that would have multiple supplements that allow you to play kind of different flavors of it. But it's another one that still exists today. But the interesting thing about Savage Worlds was it was kind of built around the idea that people wanted to get to playing a little bit more, if I'm remembering correctly. And it was another one where they created their own licensing system so that people could, third-party publishers could create content for Savage Worlds. So they would have a thing on their thing that would say "Savaged." But yeah, again, kind of showing that amazing effect that the SRD and the OGL had on the market in particular. Trying to see. I'm reading through the Wikipedia page now to try and remember all this stuff. Anyway, so Savage Worlds in and of itself, again, it did get the Origin Gamers Choice Award in 2003, so it was a pretty big deal. But again, the thing that I'm pointing to specifically here is this is one of the earlier examples of a company kind of jumping on the OGL bandwagon of, well, wait, if we license out this stuff, we can have other people make supplements for us, and so we don't have to pay to make the supplements. We don't have to worry about making a profit off of it, but every additional supplement that is created for our game creates new value for our game. So, yeah. Also, I own Savage Worlds, and it's a really cool system. So, moving on. The next RPG that we're going to talk about is Fate Core. I mentioned in my video yesterday, we talked about the Fudge engine, not because everybody loves the Fudge engine or everyone's making games on that, but because it eventually was used to create Fate, and Fate was kind of a response to games like D&D the 3rd edition. Again, I mentioned D&D 3rd edition was a big departure from 2nd edition because of just how many different things that they added. It was also a departure because it was an extremely crunchy, very, very complex tabletop RPG. One of the kind of defining features of 3rd edition is just how easy it is to create a useless character. If you don't put your attribute points in the right place, your character, after about like level 3 to 5, your character can't hit enemies anymore and gets killed almost instantly. If you don't put your skill points in the right places, your character is not going to be able to pass any sort of skill check. So in order to play D&D the 3rd edition and a lot of the OGL games, you really had to take a deep dive into the system. And it was a turnoff for a lot of people. So Fate went the exact opposite direction. Fate was based on the idea that people wanted to play more and calculate less. There's a really good, I'm going to read directly from the Wikipedia page because it describes it perfectly. It is designed to offer minimal obstruction to role-playing by assuming players want to make fewer dice rolls. That was kind of the core behind Fate Core. They wanted to create a system where people could just do role-playing, and there was enough rules there that it would make sense and you'd be able to keep going, but there weren't so many rules that it was it required, taking an entire 12 credit course in order to understand how to play. So Fate was one of the first really big popular rules light systems, and now there are tons of rules light systems. But Fate was really one of the pioneers in the market. I'm not saying there weren't rules light systems before, but Fate became really, really popular. And again, it's still available today because of just how well designed it was and just how easy it is to play. A lot of the aspects of Fate are built around the idea of the system itself should be intuitive. They don't want to bog you down with a bunch of terms and words that make sense once you understand the game, but until you learn the game, they just sound like a lot of gobbly. So they would use a lot of words that people already were very familiar with, and they would make sure that those words meant the same thing that people use them in regular parlance as they would mean in the game. So that was the whole idea behind Fate, was to make an RPG system that didn't require a degree to be able to play, and that you could just tell really cool stories. And that was another thing that was starting to see a change in the market. I've mentioned this before when I was talking about like the different versions of D&D. Chris Perkins did an interview shortly after 5th edition came out, like a few years after 5th edition came out. And he was talking about the idea that one of the easiest ways to kind of explain the difference between 5th edition and 3rd edition is how people talk about their edition online. Back when 3rd edition was popular, message boards were a thing, and forums and stuff, and so there were places where people would talk about D&D online. However, when they spoke about D&D, most of the time they would describe their builds. Like, that's what they were doing. Oh yeah, I have this really cool, Rogue 3 Fighter 7 Shadow Dancer 12 that can do this and this and this. So that was, kind of what... That was how you talked about your tabletop RPGs, was this is the build I created, which is a very technical way to talk about a game like D&D. When you got to 5th edition, most people, when they were talking about it, it's like, oh yeah, I have this really cool character who did this, and then, their parents were this, and then we were fighting this boss, and then he said this, and then we responded with this, and it was really cool. And they significantly more talk about the story that they were telling as opposed to the build of the character. And Fates was one of the games that helped kind of move tabletop RPGs forward into the idea of these are storytelling based games, not, miniature war games where you only play a single character, which is what D&D was, which is what a lot of tabletop RPGs in the 80s and 90s, with a few rare exceptions like the World of Darkness games. A lot of them were much more focused on let's make an interesting combat system and then throw some other stuff around it. So yeah, also Fate is a really, really cool system in general. You should check it out. Moving on. And as we go forward, again, Fate was 2003. We're going to go to 2004 in a second here. But I'm just going to talk about a couple of the other systems that came out that were D20 based systems. There was a Babylon 5 tabletop RPG. There was a Stargate SG-1 tabletop RPG that used a version of the D20 system. Yeah. Castle and Crusades. We'll talk about something similar to that. Oh, I completely missed the D6 stuff by West End Games. So we'll talk about D6 first. So the D6 system, again, technically was created in the 96. But in 2004, they released a bunch of supplements to kind of expand it. You had D6 Adventure, D6 Fantasy, D6 Space, all done by West End Games, which doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. But it was the original Star Wars tabletop RPG used the D6 system. Again, the first game that used the D6 engine was actually the Ghostbusters RPG. So yeah, now that we're in the 2000s, they're finally releasing various supplements to the generic version that was released in 96. But at the same time, Wizards of the Coast also released D&D Future, which was originally was going to be just an accessory for D&D D20 Modern, but it was different enough that it basically became its own system. It has its own SRD, which was used for a lot of kind of space and science fiction based TTRPGs. So it did again start kind of changing the market by making it significantly easier to create your science fiction tabletop RPGs. And yeah, other than that, like there was tons and tons and tons and tons of stuff that you could do with it. But again, new SRD and everything creates a new game. And then Shortly after that, they released in 2005 D20 Past. Again, D20 Modern was designed to tell stories that were set in like the 90s, 2000 kind of area. D20 Past was designed to be able to run games anywhere from like 1450s all the way up to like the 1950s. So a pretty significantly large chunk of time where you could play. You could tell pirate stories. You could tell World War I stories. Wild West, all that stuff was kind of put into the D20 Past moniker. And this one, I don't know if they had their own. I don't know if they had their own SRD for this one, but again, it was just another kind of flavor and version of the D20 system. The early 2000s were just covered in D20 system everything. Again, it really did change the world. So, moving on. Really? Thank you. The next RPG that we are going to talk about, we're going to jump forward to 2006. And again, some other D20 based systems, Conan the role-playing game, as we're going through stuff. Dawning Star was another D20 system. A Game of Thrones D20 system came out in 2005. Iron Heroes and Northern Crown, more D20 system. Iron Heroes specifically, the little tagline they have here is based on making D&D playable without magic. So yeah, going further and further and further. And this was also around 2005 is when White Wolf started making, what was the first one that they made? Was it Vampire the Requiem? Yeah, so Vampire the Requiem was an updated version of a vampire, but it made some pretty drastic changes that the fan base was not particularly fond of, and there was an entire kind of sub name for they called it the Chronicle of Darkness setting. So all of the original stuff by White Wolf was the World of Darkness setting, and then they created the Chronicles of Darkness setting, and it kind of pissed off a lot of the fan base, and it started showing the decline of the World of Darkness and Vampire the Masquerade kind of stuff just going down, and it was no longer a threat to D&D in any way, shape, or form. So anyway, moving forward to 2005 or 2006. Where are you? Okay, so in 2006, a new system was launched called Old School Reference and Index Compilation. This is the most successful D&D retro clones that have ever been created. If you're familiar with the acronym OSR, which stands for Old School Revolution, this was not the first OSR game to come out. Castles and Crusades, which came out, I think it was 2002. I mentioned it before. Technically came out earlier than this, and there might have been one before that. But basically, remember how I mentioned how people were not super, that third edition started creating a rift and creating the edition wars where people were like, no, the old version was much, much better. Well, the Old School Revolution was a result of that, where people going, we don't want to play this massively complicated nonsense where everything has a rule and turns take 7 years because you have to argue about every single thing, and there's like 47 different floating modifiers, and it's just not fun. And so a couple different companies started creating this OSR movement, basically trying to recreate old school tabletop RPGs pattern after like basic D&D and advanced D&D. OSRIC, or Old School Reference and Index Compilation, was by far the most successful because what it did is it used the open game license to effectively recreate old school D&D. And so because of that, because it was part of the open game license to use the system's referenced at a document, it made it significantly easier for people to be able to create new content for it. And according to the Wikipedia page, there's over 500 products that are branded as Osric compatible. The entire purpose of Osric was to give publishers tools to create new old school D&D content without having to play around with copyright issues, without having to play around with looking up the old system. This is just, they recreated Advanced Dungeons and Dragons using 3rd edition rules. And again, it was massively popular, unbelievably popular. I think it still exists today. I will look it up to make sure. Yeah, I mean, you can still get it on DriveThruRPG for free. You can get looks like the basic the basic core book is free on DriveThruRPG. So yeah, started in 2006. It's still going strong today, and the OSR movement can the fact that it's still going strong today can thank Osric for creating a system that was easy and simple for a lot of different publishers to be able to make content for it. So, yeah. And if you're wondering how it was Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, they just used a bunch of 3rd edition terms to create it. That's literally what it was. It was Advanced D&D. And because they were able to find a way to use the OGL to basically recreate Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, you no longer had to run into the issue of copyright laws and stuff like that, causing issues with creating AD&D content. That, again, that was the entire purpose, is, hey, can we reverse engineer an old version of D&D using the new rules? And they did. So, yeah. Moving on. We're now going to move to 2007. We're going to talk about a little-known system called the Gumshoe system. The Gumshoe system is another system that started leaning more heavily into the idea of this is not D&D. The Gumshoe system was specifically created around the idea that creating an investigative adventure in most tabletop RPGs is a pain in the ass, because most like mystery investigation whodunit style stuff is based around the idea of you need to find enough clues to be able to come up with a solution. And the Gumshoe system, and it was easy for players to miss clues, but because they could have a bad roll or something like that, like they fail their perception check and they don't notice that the clue that could break the case right open is right in front of them because they rolled a nat 1. So the Gumshoe system was based on the idea that it wasn't finding the clues that was the important part, it was interpreting the clues. And this is another one that created its own SRD, had its own open game license, and there's a Creative Commons of a version of Gumshoe, which I don't know when they added the Creative Commons version of that. But again, that's a really, really big deal, because that means that people can use this system without having to pay for anything, without having to worry about complex licensing features. Creative Commons is really, really, really great for expanding creativity and encouraging creativity, which is probably why it's called Creative Commons. The game from the Gumshoe system that I'm most familiar with is Trail of Cthulhu, which didn't come out until I think 2009, 2010. But it just is an example of the Gumshoe system doing really, really well. And again, an idea of we're creating a system specifically because you generally can't do this in other tabletop RPGs. So you want to run kind of mystery noir style games, use the Gumshoe system. So, yeah. Moving on. The next game we talk about, we're going to go forward to 2008. And we are Let's try this again. I missed it. Where are you? There we go. We're going to talk about Dark Heresy, which is the first book in the Warhammer 40k role-playing game. Warhammer 40k, or Warhammer 40,000, has been around for a long time. I'm trying to see when it was first. Yeah, 87 is when it first came out. And it is a tabletop miniatures game. And anyone that might remember where D&D came from, it was originally a bunch of miniature war gamers that came together and created this system called Chainmail to make medieval war a thing, and then went, hey, what if instead of it being a war game, what if you were just playing a single character and there were wizards and stuff like that? That's where D&D came from. Where, well, Dark Heresy kind of does that again, where you had a tabletop war game that eventually went, well, we have this amazing lore for this game. What if we let people kind of live in that world and kind of learn about and create characters in that? And that's where you get the Dark Heresy. There's been tons of, I guess not tons. There's been quite a few different Warhammer 40k games. I think I own most of them. So you had Dark Heresy, you had Rogue Trader, you had... What are the ones that I have? Because I can go here. I think, yeah, Warhammer 40k. There's Black Crusade, Death Watch, Only War, Rogue Trader. The only one I don't have is Dark Heresy. That's impressive. So, yeah, but it's, again, it's an example of other mediums starting to bleed back into to tabletop RPGs. And anyone that's familiar with the Warhammer 40k universe in general, dark does not begin to describe it. Warhammer 40k is basically what happened if the bad guys won and then just kept winning for a few millennia. Like, it's such a dark, disturbing future. So, yeah, there's not a whole lot more I can say about it. Mostly because I haven't played specifically Dark Heresy. I know Rogue Trader a little bit better. Excuse me. But yeah, another thing that started to kind of to change the tabletop RPG space. So, moving on. Take another drink. Now we're getting to 2009. We're getting to the end of this decade. And a really unique nonsense game that came out is called Fiasco. Fiasco is a GM-less tabletop RPG. Now, some people will kind of argue with the idea of calling Fiasco a TTRPG because, you don't level up and stuff like that. But the entire purpose of Fiasco is for you to create characters and tell an interesting, if not complete nonsense, story. So you can classify it as a board game. You can classify it as an RPG, but it did definitely show a shift in the market as more and more games were being created to tailor to people that just wanted to tell really cool, interesting stories. And this one in particular was designed to avoid one of the biggest hurdles in running tabletop RPGs and playing tabletop RPGs, which is finding someone to DM tends to be a bit of a nightmare. And this is coming from a forever GM. The biggest problem I see most people talking about is like, man, I wish I could play D&D. Man, I wish I could play Pathfinder. Man, I wish I could play this, insert this RPG here. But I can never find a DM. Or, the DMs that I've dealt with were just not for fun, or I didn't like this, or here's my RPG horror story that's totally not made up for Reddit. Reddit popularity. I can't remember what they call the points at Reddit, but... yeah, so Fiasco is specifically created. Everyone technically is the GM. You all work together to create a compelling story, and it is interesting. Will Wheaton's Tabletop in the first season did an episode on Fiasco where they played Fiasco, and it was unbelievably fun to watch. And it was around this time, because again, now that we're in 2009, D&D the third edition is over. D&D the third edition support for it ended in, I think, like 2007-ish, because in 2008, D&D fourth edition was launched. And so around the time that fourth edition launched, we also started getting things like... Acquisitions Incorporated. I just want to see if they have the date for the first Acquisitions Incorporated. Anyway, Acquisitions Incorporated, I believe, started in like 2010, somewhere around there. But it was kind of the start of RPGs as... to quote Chris Perkins, D&D can be a spectator sport. Fiasco was supposed to be as entertaining to kind of watch as it was to play, mostly because everyone playing Fiasco was also watching it at the same time. So it does show a shift in the market towards the idea of storytelling over mechanics. So, yeah, moving on. Finally, 2009, I would be doing a disservice if I didn't mention Pathfinder, the role-playing game. Pathfinder, the role-playing game, was specifically... I guess it's not the first kind of spite-based tabletop RPG, because I would kind of classify the OSR as kind of those spite-based... well, we don't like it, so we're just going to play our own game, and we're going to publish our own game because this is the cool way. I mean, that's what Pathfinder was. It was a lot of people that were upset with 4th edition. They didn't like how different 4th edition was from 3rd edition, and they didn't like the fact that they had to spend so much time and energy and effort to learn the ungodly complicated version of D&D that 3rd edition was, just for them to have to basically throw it away in less than 8 years. They were expecting, because D&D 2nd edition lasted for 11 years. And so they were expecting to be able to play this game and have it supported for well over a decade, because every version of D&D got longer. So like, well, what about... and this one didn't. And so a bunch of... a bunch of people kind of... I'm trying to look and see specifically. Sorry. I was trying to see specifically, because I remember reading once that the people from Paizo were old kind of Wizards employees that kind of left. But the interesting thing about Paizo in general is Paizo was publishing the Dragon magazine and Dungeon magazine since 2002. And then when 4th edition came out, they're like, well, no, we're going to make... We want to still play 3rd edition. And so they did like a year-long play test in 2008. And then they officially published in 2009, and the rest is history. Pathfinder has regularly been the number 2 RPG in the market for a really, really long time. More recently, when they introduced Pathfinder 2nd Edition in 2018, they started seeing their hold on 2nd place slipping pretty hard, partially because the exact thing happened to Pathfinder that happened to D&D when 4th edition was released, which is people went, well, wait a minute, we like the old version, why would we want to play the new version? And so they basically splintered their player base into 2 different groups, people that were playing 2nd edition and people that were playing 1st edition. And 2nd edition was not particularly well received in general, because while it did move away from the OGL to where it was no longer just D&D with some paint on it, a lot of the changes that they made it significantly more complex, and added even more rules that they really didn't need, and it turned into a very, very, very crunchy version and very formulaic version of what people were interested in. But it's still popular today. And then they created the Orc license, which was nonsense and stupid, and is doing super, super well, showing all the people that originally were going to sign on to the Orc license are now being published on D&D Beyond. Congratulations, Pathfinder. Lying to your customer base and abusing all of your staff doesn't work very well, does it? But ignoring my disdain for Paizo as a company and Pathfinder Bros in general, Pathfinder really was monumental as far as the market was concerned, because Pathfinder, in addition to the ORSAR stuff, but Pathfinder did it better, to be frank, was a huge... It was proof that the players themselves didn't have to just take whatever they were given. Like, up until that point, it was like, well, it doesn't matter if you don't like D&D 3rd edition. We're never going to publish anything for D&D 2nd edition ever again. So if you want to keep using those old books, go ahead and do that. Don't expect to get anything new. And so the OSR was created to kind of go, well, we like the 1st edition. We're going to try and start making that stuff. And it worked okay. Pathfinder was so different in the idea that not only was it them going, no, if you're not going to support this, we are. And it worked. It wasn't just that, hey, we created a system and people can use it. It was, we created a way to keep supporting a dead version of the game. People can use it, and people do. It was insanely popular. And it influenced a lot of other companies. Once they saw that the players could actually dictate where the market goes, it basically became a player's market. And Pathfinder is one of the big things that inspired D&D 5th edition. You know, seeing how well the playtest worked for Pathfinder, D&D Next did a significantly longer playtest to create D&D 5th edition. So you really can't, as much as, again, I'm not a fan of Pathfinder, you really can't understate how influential Pathfinder was to tabletop RPGs as a whole, because it wasn't the first time that the fans basically took back something from the creators, but it was by far the most successful version of it. And it would be felt for, again, the next decade and a half. I mean, again, Pathfinder came out in 2009, so it was 15 years old this past year. Like, that's a really impressive thing. Pathfinder outlasted D&D the third edition. So I do find it kind of funny, though, that, again, D&D 3rd edition, they announced 4th edition in August of 2007. So D&D 3rd edition lasted roughly about 7-ish years. And again, they were mad because they're like, well, it should last for over a decade. They announced Pathfinder 2nd edition in August of 2019, so 9 years. So Pathfinder, before they attempted to replace it with a new version, Pathfinder didn't last a decade either. It lasted just slightly longer than D&D the 3rd edition. So yeah, I just find that humorous. If there's any Pathfinder bros out there, are people still publishing materials for Pathfinder for the 1st edition? Like, is it still being supported? I don't think Paizo's publishing anything about it anymore. But is it still being supported by the third parties, or is it entirely just 2nd edition, and anyone playing Pathfinder 1st edition is just using old books in that? Let me know in the comments down below. Anyway, that was the 2000s. Now, again, I was not actively playing, and I was not actively part of the community in this time, so there's a very good chance that I missed something in here. So if you were a part of this time period, and you noticed that I completely forgot about one of the most influential games ever, let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, that's all for me today. We'll see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.